The archive smelled like old paper and something underneath it, something older, the way rain smells before it touches the ground. Marin Osei pressed her palm flat against the cover of the ledger and felt its weight. Real weight, not the phantom mass of a data tablet, but the density of a thing that had existed in time. She had spent 11 years learning to read the handwriting inside it. She had spent the last 3 learning to hide it, outside the window of the sub-basement. If you could call a ventilation slot a window, the city of Caliph moved in its ordinary rhythm. Trams hummed along magnetic rails. Citizens pressed thumbs to transit panels and were admitted or denied. Above the old district, the needle of the Veth administrative tower caught the first color of morning and held it, copper going briefly gold, before the light moved on. "They know about the Rotterdam collection," said a voice behind her. Marin did not turn around. She had heard Davy come down the stairs. She always heard Davy, who moved like a man convinced that silence was a form of dishonesty. He was holding 2 cups of something hot and setting one beside her without asking, which was the only reason she had tolerated him for 6 years. "How certain," she said. "Certain enough that they sent an examiner. Not a clerk, an examiner." She turned then. Davy Colm was 43 years old, built like someone who had once been broader and had been slowly compressed by work into something denser and quieter. He had been a field archivist before joining the Continuance Project, which many had spent years in the outer provinces cataloging what people kept in attics and under floorboards when they did not quite trust the official record, but did not quite know why. He had an archivist's particular form of alertness, not the alertness of a man watching for danger, but the alertness of a man watching for meaning. "Which examiner?" Marin asked. "Sorvith." She let out a breath that wasn't quite a sigh and wasn't quite a curse. Sorvith. She had read his file twice. His real name was Tavin Sorvithmal, born in the capital of the Veth Consolidated Empire 41 years ago, to parents who were both administrators of the middle grade. He had studied law and then, unusually, historiography, not the kind that involved archives, but the kind that involved the management of them. He had written a paper, which she had read in its original monograph form, arguing that collective memory was a public health concern, and that states had not only the right, but the obligation to curate what their populations retained. The paper had won a prize. He had been appointed to the Bureau of Cultural Coherence 4 years later. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of person who would be sent to destroy what they had spent a decade assembling. "We moved the Rotterdam materials tonight," Marin said. "To where?" "The 3rd cache is already full. Then we make a 4th. D.A.V. sat down in a chair across from her and wrapped both hands around his cup. "Marin, there are 6 of us. There are 9,000 registered examiners in the Bureau, and that's not counting the military adjuncts they can requisition if they decide this qualifies as a security matter. At some point." "At some point what?" He looked at her steadily. He had a way of looking at people that made them feel he was reading something written on the inside of their face. "At some point," he said, "we have to decide what we're actually trying to accomplish. If it's survival, we need a different strategy. If it's preservation, we need a different strategy. If it's both, we need a miracle." "It's testimony," Marin said. "That's what it is. That's what it's always been." She turned back to the ledger. On the page before her, in the cramped and slanting hand of a woman named Isel Koroth, who had died 212 years ago, was a list of names. Just names. 47 of them, organized into columns, with occupations noted beside them in smaller writing. Farmer, fisher, teacher of small children, weaver. The woman named Isel had survived what the Veth Empire currently called the pacification of the Selous Lowlands, and had written down the names of everyone she personally knew who had not. The ledger had been passed from her daughter to her granddaughter to a stranger who had understood what it was, and then across 4 more generations of strangers, until it arrived at a market in the city of Rotterdam, which no longer existed by that name, having been renamed Calisecondary during the administrative reorganization of 340, where D.A.V. Colm had found it in a box of old cookbooks and paid 14 credits for the lot. 47 names. In the official record, the pacification of the Selous Lowlands was a 3-paragraph entry in the Imperial Historical Compendium, describing a period of civil unrest followed by a stabilizing intervention. The word death did not appear. The word fire did not appear. The 47 names did not appear. They appeared here. We're not fighting an army, Marin said. We're fighting a story. And you don't fight a story with an army. You fight it with a better one. Tavin Sorvathmal arrived in Kalat on the 4th day of the month of reaching, which the old calendar would call something else, but did not, because the old calendar had been discontinued. He traveled alone, which was his habit. He found that colleagues complicated observation. They talked during the silences when you needed to be listening, and they had opinions that contaminated your own before you had finished forming them. The city was pleasant. Most provincial cities were, in his experience, because the empire had standardized pleasant. The transit system worked. The administrative plaza was clean. The memorial to the unification stood at the center of it. 10 meters of pale stone featuring the figure of the first administrator, with one hand raised and the other lowering a posture that was intended to suggest both command and care. Tavin had seen 17 copies of this memorial in 17 different cities, and had long since stopped seeing them. He checked into the administrative guest house and then walked, because walking was his other habit. He walked through the old district, which had survived the reorganizations with more of its original character intact than the planners would have preferred. Here the streets were narrower and wound around each other in ways that suggested they had grown rather than been designed. The buildings were older, with window frames of actual wood, and the signs above some of the shops were in two scripts, the Imperial Standard and below it in smaller letters, something older that most people could no longer read. He stopped in front of one such shop. It sold books, physical books, which were legal but unusual, and which the Bureau tracked as a matter of standard procedure, because people who valued physical books tended to value physical things in general, and physical things were harder to update. The sign above the door read, in both scripts, something that he translated as the Memory House, which was either a charming provincial affectation or an act of deliberate provocation, and which Tavin made a note to determine. Inside, a young woman was arranging books on a shelf. She did not look up when he entered, which was either trained indifference or genuine absorption. She was perhaps 25, with the careful hands of someone who handled fragile things professionally. "Good morning," Tavin said. "Good morning." She placed the book on the shelf with the particular gentleness that archivists use, as if the object were listening. "Are you looking for something specific?" "I'm looking," Tavin said, "for whoever runs this establishment." "That would be me." She turned and looked at him directly. Her name, he would learn, was Senna, and she was the youngest member of the Continuance Project, and she had been chosen for this particular position because she was very good at looking at people who wanted to frighten her and not being frightened. "How can I help you?" "I'm from the Bureau of Cultural Coherence," Tavin said. He did not produce his identification because he had found, over the years, that not producing it worked better. The offer of identification, declined, suggests cooperation. The absence of identification, unmentioned, suggests that authority is simply present in the air between you, the way gravity is. We've had some concerns raised about certain materials circulating in this district. Old materials. You understand. "I'm afraid I don't," Senna said pleasantly. "But I'm happy to answer any questions you have about our inventory. Everything we carry is registered with the Cultural Licensing Office." "Of course," Tavin said. He looked around the shop. The books on the shelves were, as she said, licensed. History is approved by the Compendium Office. Literature from approved periods. Practical volumes on agriculture and craft. Everything in its proper place. He had expected nothing less. What he was actually looking for, he would not find here. He had come here to be seen looking, which was different. He thanked her and left. 2 blocks away, he stopped and wrote a single sentence in the small notebook he carried everywhere. She was not frightened. He underlined it. The 4th cache was in the basement of a building that had once been a water treatment facility and now served as a storage depot for a grain distribution cooperative. This was Lev Anton's arrangement. Lev was 60 years old and had worked for the cooperative for 20 years and was trusted by them in a way that people who do their job precisely and never ask for anything are trusted, which is to say completely. He was also, quietly, a man who had grown up in the Selous lowlands and whose grandmother had survived what the Empire called a pacification. He had never spoken of this to the others. He mentioned it now because they were all crowded into the basement at 2 in the morning carrying boxes, and Marin had made the mistake of asking him why he had joined the project, and Lev was a man who answered questions honestly. She used to describe it in stages, he said, setting down a box of microfilm canisters. The Continuance Project used microfilm for its secondary backups because microfilm could not be remotely wiped. First stage, the soldiers came. Second stage, certain things were not permitted. Third stage, certain things were not discussed. Fourth stage, there was nothing to discuss because nothing had happened. She said the fourth stage was the worst because by then most people believed it. She was a strange one. She was the one who remembered something that, officially, had not occurred. No one said anything for a moment. The basement smelled of old concrete and the faint sweetness of grain dust filtering down to the floor above. "How old were you when she told you this?" asked a sixth member of their group, a woman named Preetha, who had been a librarian for the Imperial Public Archive before she had been quietly dismissed for what her termination notice described as inconsistencies in cataloging philosophy. She was 52 and wore her hair in a single gray braid and was the person they all trusted most with the actual organization materials, because she thought about provenance the way other people thought about air, as a fundamental condition of everything else. 7, Lev said, old enough to understand that she was telling me something dangerous, not old enough to understand why. "And now?" Marin asked. He looked at the boxes. "Now I understand why. The why is that it works. Forgetting works. If you can make people forget long enough, eventually you don't need to make them anymore. They do it themselves. The wound closes and new skin grows over it, and after a while you can't see the scar at all. Except," he paused, "except," Preetha said, "except it's still there, under the skin. The body knows." Tavin Sorvathmal spent his second evening in Caliph, reviewing the files his office had assembled on the Continuance Project. The files were incomplete, which annoyed him less than it might have annoyed a different kind of man. Incomplete files told you things. They told you what was easy to see and what was not. The easy-to-see things were the bookshop, registered 4 years ago, owned by one Centervale, licensed for cultural materials distribution. A lecture series on pre-unification literature, also registered, sparsely attended, held in the back room of the bookshop on the second and fourth Tuesdays of each month. A website, the Empire permitted websites, on which someone posted periodically about the importance of comprehensive historical education, which was not illegal but was a kind of phrase that accumulated in files. The not easy to see things were everything else. He had been doing this work for 12 years. He had managed 17 significant cases of what the Bureau called historical destabilization, which was the official term for project of recovering and disseminating materials the Empire had chosen to retire. He understood how these groups worked. They were not violent. They were almost pathologically nonviolent, because they understood that violence gave the Bureau tools it did not otherwise have. What they used instead was patience. And physical objects. Physical objects were the thing that kept them up at night, not because they were more durable than digital materials, though they were, but because they required physical retrieval. You could not wipe a book from a server. You had to go and find it and take it. And in finding it, you had to know where it was. The problem with this particular group was that he did not know where anything was. He poured himself a glass of water from the carafe on the desk and thought about the woman in the bookshop, the careful hands, the unhurried eyes, the particular quality of her non-fear. What he had observed in his 12 years was that there were 2 kinds of people who did this work. The first kind were motivated by ideology. They had a political position, a belief about how the world should be organized, and historical recovery was a tool in service of that belief. These people were, paradoxically, easy to handle. They made arguments. Arguments could be countered with other arguments, or with force, or with a simple demonstration that the argument was no longer viable. They could be demoralized. The second kind were different. The second kind were motivated by something he had never found a precise word for. It was not ideology. It was something prior to ideology, a relationship with the past itself, a conviction that the past was not a resource to be managed, but a kind of presence that demanded acknowledgement. These people did not argue their position, so much as embody it. They were, in his experience, essentially impossible to demoralize, because demoralization required that you had something to lose, and these people had already decided that what they were doing was itself the point. The woman in the bookshop had the eyes of the second kind. He set down the glass and wrote a second sentence in his notebook. Beneath the first, "This will not end with a raid." He sat with that for a while. Then he added, "It will end with a trial." The thing that most people did not understand about the Veth Consolidated Empire, the thing that the empire itself worked very hard to ensure that people did not understand, was that it was not old. It felt old. It had the infrastructure of age, the memorials, the compendium, the administrative traditions that had accumulated over centuries the way sediment accumulated, layer by layer, each layer compressing the ones below it. But the empire as it currently existed, with its particular understanding of its own history, was 512 years old. Before that, there had been something else. Marin knew what that something else had been because she had spent her adult life learning it. The scholarship was not easy to find. It had not been destroyed, exactly, because the empire was too sophisticated for simple destruction, but it had been moved, reclassified, restricted, and above all it had been decontextualized, stripped the connections that gave it meaning, scattered across archives in ways that made it nearly impossible to assemble into a coherent picture unless you already knew what you were looking for. This was, she had come to believe, the more elegant form of erasure. You did not burn the evidence. You made the evidence incomprehensible. What she had assembled over 11 years, with the help of DAV and Preetha and Lev and Senna, and the sixth member of their group, a man named Theo Wex, who had formerly been a cartographer for the Imperial Survey and who now spent his days cross-referencing place names from old documents with current administrative designations, was a picture, not a complete picture. There were gaps, and she had tried to be honest about the gaps, because honesty about gaps was the only thing that distinguished what she was doing from what the Empire was doing. What the Empire was doing was also creating a picture. The difference was that the Empire's picture claimed to be complete. Her picture said, 512 years ago, the Veth Consolidated Empire was not founded. It was imposed. It was imposed on 14 distinct peoples who had been living in the territory it now claimed, and the imposition involved, in the 6-year period that the compendium called the Founding Consolidations, approximately 200,000 deaths, not in battle. The record was clear on this, insofar as the record existed at all, because some of it had survived in exactly the dispersed and durable form that physical documents took, but in what could only be called extermination campaigns. Systematic, documented at the time, in the administrative records of the military governors who carried them out, with the bureaucratic precision that mass murder requires when it is conducted by a state rather than a mob. Those administrative records were the Rotterdam materials. They had been found in a sealed cellar beneath a building in what was now Cala Secondary, during a renovation project, by a construction worker who had not known what they were, but had known they were old and had, on an impulse he later said he could not explain, put them in his truck rather than the demolition debris. He had eventually brought them to a dealer in old documents. The dealer had brought them to DAV Colm, who had brought them to Marin, who had spent 3 years with Preetha deciphering them. They were written in the administrative hand of the early empire, clear, careful, precise. They were requisition orders, supply manifests, communications between field commanders and the central administrative authority. They were, in a strictly bureaucratic sense, boring documents. They were also, in every other sense, evidence of the worst thing the empire had ever done, written by the people who had done it, for the people who had ordered it. The empire had known about the Rotterdam cache for approximately 8 months. Marin knew this because she had a source inside the bureau, whose name she did not know and who communicated only through the elaborate dead-drop system that Preetha had designed, which involved a specific arrangement of books on the shelf of the Memory House bookshop. She did not know how the bureau had found out about the cache. She had her suspicions, which she had not shared with the others, because suspicion directed at members of a small group could be more destructive than the thing it suspected. What she knew was that Sorvata's arrival in Caliph was not exploratory. He had been sent to recover materials and close the project down. What she had been working toward for the past 8 months was making that impossible. The lectures had been running for 2 years. Marin had not attended them herself. She was careful about direct association with any of the project's public-facing activities, but she had written most of what was presented at them, and Senna delivered the material with a quality that Marin had come to think of as structured casualness. It sounded like someone talking. It sounded like someone with an interesting hobby who wanted to share it. It did not sound like what it was, which was a systematic and carefully sequenced education in a history that the Empire had chosen not to include in its approved curriculum. The lectures were also recorded, not officially. Official recorder would have required registration with the Bureau of Cultural Coherence, which would have triggered review. They were recorded by the attendees themselves on personal devices, and then they were copied and sent to other people who sent them to other people. Marin did not know how far the recordings had spread. She had deliberately not tried to track this, because tracking would have created a record of the network, and a record of the network could be found. What she was counting on was that the network existed without her being able to fully account for it, which was the point, which had always been the point. Theo Wex brought her the maps on the evening of the 6th day after Sorvitha's arrival. The maps were the product of 4 years of work. Cross-references between the place names mentioned in the Rotterdam administrative documents and the current Imperial Geographical Survey, with annotations showing which current locations corresponded to which historical sites. What the maps showed, when you looked at them, was that the geography of the Selous lowlands, the farms and towns and transit stops that people moved through without thinking about them, was layered over a geography of something that had happened there 500 years ago. People were living on ground that had a history they had not been permitted to know. If someone wanted to, Theo said, spreading the maps on the table, they could walk the old province. They could go to those places. They could stand there. That's the idea, Marin said. I know that's the idea. I made the maps. I'm telling you it works. I walked it myself. Last year, just to see. I stood in what is now the Calais Secondary Transit Hub, which is built on the site of what the Rotterdam documents call the Selous Administrative Center, which is where he stopped. Where the final orders were issued, Marin said, "Yes." He looked at the maps for a moment. It's just a transit hub. Clean. Functional. The trams run through it every 4 minutes. People stand there, and they don't know what they're standing on. He paused again. They should know. They will, Marin said. She hoped this was true. She believed it was true. She had built the whole structure of the past decade on the belief that it was true, and she was honest enough with herself to recognize that this belief was not purely rational. It was something closer to a conviction, which was what you had when evidence alone wasn't sufficient to explain why you kept going. Tavin Sorvithmal requested a meeting with the local administrative authority on his 7th day in Calais. He had taken his time. He had walked. He had visited the bookshop twice more, buying books on the second visit. A history of regional architecture, an approved compendium of pre-unification folk literature, and Senna had been polite and precise and had given him nothing. The local administrator was a man named Forin Dak, 60 years old, cautious in the way of men who had been administrators for long enough to have survived several changes in the preferences of their superiors. He received Tavin in his office with tea and a very studied neutrality. "I'm here in an advisory capacity," Tavin said, which was not true, but which had the advantage of being soothing. "The Bureau has some concerns about certain archival activities in the old district. Nothing that requires immediate action. I'm here to assess." "Of course," Forin said. He had the face of a man who had long ago learned not to say anything that could be quoted. "What can you tell me about the Memory House bookshop, the one on Lesson Street?" Forin considered. "It's properly registered. The proprietor is compliant with all licensing requirements. She runs a small lecture series, also registered, on historical literature. The attendance is modest." "Have you attended any of these lectures?" A pause. "No, but you know what's presented at them." Another pause. "I've been informed generally." Tavin looked at him. And, Forin said carefully, "The materials covered are not on the restricted list. They're adjacent to restricted areas of inquiry. But they don't cross the threshold that would require Bureau intervention. That was my assessment." "I see." Tavin set down his tea. "The Bureau's assessment may differ." Forin said nothing. "What I'm trying to determine," Tavin said, "is whether what's happening here is a genuine public order concern or whether it's an academic exercise that has been poorly managed but doesn't represent an actual threat to cultural coherence. I tend," he added, and this was true, "to prefer the former characterization when possible." Cases that can be resolved administratively are preferable to cases that require legal action. Foran looked at him with something that might have been either relief or calculation. I've had the same view. Then perhaps you can help me understand the full scope of what these people are doing. What Foran told him, over the next hour, was both more and less than Tavin had expected. More. The lecture series had been running longer than the registered dates indicated, having begun informally before registration, and the attendance, while modest, had a consistent and growing core of regulars who had been bringing friends. Less. Foran had no knowledge of the archive, no knowledge of the Rotterdam cache, no knowledge of the Continuance Project as an organized entity. He knew about a bookshop and some lectures. He knew about a general atmosphere of historical curiosity in the old district that he had attributed to the character of a neighborhood. After the meeting, Tavin walked to the memorial in the administrative plaza. He stood in front of the first administrator with the raised hand and the lowered hand and thought about what Foran had said. The character of the neighborhood. That was an interesting phrase. He had been in neighborhoods like this before, cities where something had happened, and where the happening had not quite been fully covered over. You could feel it in the specific density of the silence around certain subjects. You could feel it in the way people who had grown up here moved through the old streets, not with the unconscious ease of people in a place that belonged to them, but with something more deliberate, as if they were walking with an awareness that the ground had a history. He had always found this interesting. He had written about it. In fact, the paper that had won the prize. He had argued that this kind of ambient historical consciousness was destabilizing, that it created a population oriented toward the past rather than the present, resistant to the administrative present tense that good governance required. He had argued that the state had an obligation to manage this. He still believed this. He believed it as a matter of policy. What he had not written in the paper, what he would not have known how to write in the paper 12 years ago, was that the ambient historical consciousness also told you something true, not about what policy should be, about what had happened. He stood in front of the memorial and looked at the first administrator's raised hand and thought, I know what the Rotterdam documents say. He had read the summary in the classified bureau file. He had not read the documents themselves. But the summary was sufficient to understand what they were: administrative records of mass killing, kept in the efficient style of bureaucrats who were doing their jobs. The summary had been filed in 340, when the documents were first discovered during a previous renovation of the site, and had been classified by the Bureau, and the cache sealed, and the site built over. He had been born a year later. He had never thought about this before. He was thinking about it now. The first administrator's raised hand pointed toward nothing in particular, toward the sky of Caliph on an ordinary morning, traffic moving on the trams, people pressing thumbs to panels, being admitted or denied. Tavin put his notebook in his pocket, without writing anything. He walked back to the administrative guest house. On the 10th day, the Bureau sent the legal notice. Marin read it on Dav's tablet. They did not have personal devices registered in their own names, which was a precaution that had taken years to implement properly, and which Preetha had organized with a thoroughness she brought to everything, and then handed it back to him without comment. They've identified the bookshop as the organizational center, DAV said. Yes. They've named Senna as the primary respondent. Yes. She knows. She knew this was possible from the beginning. Marin looked at the wall. The basement of the water treatment building smelled of old concrete and grain, and the particular cold that comes from being underground. She volunteered for the specific position because she understood what it might mean. And the archive? They don't mention the archive. She paused. They don't know where it is. Yet, Marin agreed. But that's not the main thing. The main thing is the notice itself. DAV looked at her. Explain. They filed a legal action. Legal actions require proceedings. Proceedings require a record. The record of the proceedings will document what they're trying to suppress. She said this carefully, because she had thought about it for months and wanted to say it precisely. We can't fight them in court and win. We don't have the standing or the resources, but we can force them to state in a legal record what they are doing and why. And a legal record is a document, and documents survive. The silence lasted for several seconds. You planned for this, Lev said. He had been sitting in the corner, not speaking, with a stillness that she had come to understand was not passivity, but a kind of gathering. I planned for everything I could think of, Marin said. I couldn't think of everything. What couldn't you think of? She looked at him. Weather will be enough. Senna appeared for her preliminary examination 11 days after the notice, in the administrative court on the second floor of the Calais Civic Building. She appeared alone, which was itself a statement. The continuance project had no lawyer, because lawyers cost money, and also because having a lawyer suggested that you were mounting a defense, and Marin had decided that they were not mounting a defense. They were mounting a record. Tavin Sorvathmal conducted the examination. He had read the case file again that morning and had added something to his notebook. Several things, actually, in the smaller handwriting he used when he was thinking out loud. And he looked at the young woman across the table and felt, for the first time in 12 years of this work, something he did not immediately have a name for. You are Senna Vale, he said. I am. You operate the Memory House bookshop on Lesson Street, in the old district of Calais. I do. You are also associated with a series of events described as historical lectures, which have been held in the premises of the bookshop over a period of approximately 2 years. I am. And you are aware, Tavin said, that certain materials, physical archival materials, documents of historical origin, have been circulating among individuals connected to these lectures, and that these materials are the subject of this examination. A pause. I'm aware that the Bureau believes this. He looked at her. Do you dispute it? Another pause, shorter. I dispute the characterization that it represents a problem. Tell me why. She looked back at him with those unhurried eyes. Because the documents you're describing, assuming they exist as you described them, are historical records. They document things that happened, things that were done. If they exist, they are true. And I don't think true things are problems. True things, Tavin said, presented in isolation without context, without the interpretive framework that responsible historical scholarship provides, can function as... The interpretive framework, Senna said, is 47 names. She said this quietly, not as an interruption, but as an arrival. That's what I would say to you. If we were talking about specific materials, which I'm not confirming we are, the interpretive framework is the name of each person who was in a place that stopped existing because of what someone else decided to do. The names are the context. The names are everything. The court recorder was typing. Everything said here would be filed. It was already a document. Tavin said, the materials in question, if they exist as I believe they do, represent a selective and inflammatory presentation of historical events that the Imperial Compendium has characterized as... The Imperial Compendium, Senna said, still quietly, does not include those 47 names. The compendium is the authoritative. The compendium does not include the names, she said, because the people who compiled it chose not to include them. That's a choice. That's not authority. That's a choice about what to remember and what to allow to be forgotten. And I think that choice is wrong. I think it was wrong when it was made, and I think it's wrong now, and I think you know it's wrong. She said this last sentence without aggression, without accusation. She said it the way you might say something to someone you had decided to tell the truth, because you had decided there was no point in not telling the truth. The court recorder was typing. Tavin looked at his notebook. He had not opened it during the examination, but he was aware of what was written in it. He said, this examination is adjourned. We will resume in 3 days. He went, that evening, to the Memory House bookshop. It was closed, but Senna was still inside, organizing shelves. He could see her through the window. He knocked on the glass. She opened the door. She did not look surprised, which meant she had been expecting something like this, or which meant she was simply a person who was not surprised by things. May I come in? He said. She considered him for a moment. Then she stepped back. Inside, the shop smelled of paper and something else. Old wood, and particular quiet of rooms that had been filled with attention over a long time. He stood in the middle of it and looked at the shelves and thought about what a room full of physical books meant, not in the policy sense, in the simple sense. All these things that people had wanted to say, all these things that people had wanted to remember. I need to understand something, he said. Not for the examination, for myself. Senna said nothing. She was watching him. Why, physical documents, he said. You know, it's the thing that makes you most vulnerable. Digital materials can be distributed, copied, encrypted, made essentially impossible to fully retrieve. Physical materials can be found and taken. Why insist on physical? She looked at the shelves. Because they were there, she said. The Rotterdam materials, the ledger, all of it. They existed as physical things because they were made at a time when physical things were all there were. And they survived as physical things because people made choices about what to keep. Actual choices. Someone picked up the ledger and carried it. Someone sealed the cellar. Someone put the documents in a truck instead of the debris pile. Those choices are part of the record. You can't copy that onto a server. The history of how something was preserved is part of what it means. He was quiet for a while. Outside, a tram went by on its rail. The precise hum of the present tense. I've read the summary, he said. The bureau file on the Rotterdam documents. I know, she said. He looked at her. You know, we knew it existed when we found the cache. We found a reference to the original discovery in an administrative memo from 340. Someone in the bureau had already been there. They sealed it and built a transit hub on top of it and filed a summary and classified it. She paused. You've been carrying that summary for 12 years, or something like it. He had not said he had been with the bureau for 12 years. She knew anyway. What does it mean to you? She asked. Not aggressively. Genuinely. He thought about it. He thought about the first administrator's raised hand pointing at nothing. He thought about the transit hub and the trams running through it every 4 minutes. He thought about his paper, the one that had won the prize, and what it had argued, and whether it was true. I don't know yet, he said. The second day of the formal proceedings was a day that changed things, though no one, watching from outside, would have known that. It looked like a procedural session. The Bureau's legal representative, a man named Korith Young, efficient, the kind of lawyer who thought about cases in terms of structures to be dismantled, presented the Bureau's formal position, which was that the Continuance Project constituted an unauthorized organization engaged in the creation and distribution of non-approved historical materials with the intent to destabilize cultural coherence. Marin was present as a named associate. She sat very still and listened to Korth's presentation and thought about the 47 names and the hundreds of other names in the other documents and the thousands of names they had not yet found. When Korth finished, the examining magistrate, a woman named Suvek, careful and experienced, who had the particular quality of attention that good judges develop, the quality of actually listening to what was being said rather than waiting for the things she had expected to hear, looked at the Bureau's written submission, and then at the materials the Continuance Project had filed in response. What the Continuance Project had filed was not a legal brief. It was a document, 47 pages, one for each name in Isel Karatha's ledger, containing a summary of what was known about that person, occupation, family, the circumstances of their death as recorded in the Rotterdam administrative documents, and cross-referenced with the ledger and with whatever other sources existed. Some pages were very short. The page for the Weaver name tech said only Tech Weaver, mentioned in requisition order filed on the 14th day of the month of settling, 240 IE, as among those to be removed from the processing area before the area was cleared. No further records found. The page for the teacher of small children named Anat ran to 2 pages because she appeared in multiple documents and because, remarkably, she appeared by name in a letter that had been found in the Rotterdam cache, a letter written by a military administrator to a colleague, complaining about the difficulty of maintaining order in the processing area, because a woman who had been a teacher kept insisting on organizing the children into groups and teaching them songs while they waited. The examining magistrate read each page. This took a long time. No one in the courtroom spoke. Korth shuffled his papers once and then stopped. When Suvek looked up, she looked at Marin first, and then at Korth, and then at Tavin Sorvadmal, who was sitting slightly to one side, in the observer's seat he had taken for this session, and who had not moved once during the reading. The Bureau's submission, Suvek said carefully, characterizes these materials as destabilizing. I want to understand what is meant by that. Destabilizing relative to what? Korth stood. Relative to the approved historical record, magistrate. The Imperial Compendium represents. The Imperial Compendium, Suvek said in the same careful voice, does not mention these 47 individuals. Is that correct? A pause. That's correct, but the compendium is not intended to be. It is intended to be the authoritative account of imperial history. That is its stated purpose. She set down the document. The Bureau's position appears to be that the existence of materials that expand or contradict the approved account constitutes a public order threat. I want the Bureau to explain to me, on the record, what harm it believes will result from the population of Caliph, knowing the names of 47 individuals who died in this territory 500 years ago. Cora said, the harm, magistrate, is to the integrity of... No, she said, I'm asking about harm. Concrete harm. Who is harmed and how? The silence that followed was a kind of silence that, once it existed in a record, could not be removed from the record. Cora said, the Bureau's position is that the authorization framework for historical materials exists to prevent. I understand the Bureau's position, Suvek said. I am asking the Bureau to defend it in terms of actual harm. Please do so. Korath was silent. You may take a recess to prepare your response, Suvek said. We will resume in 1 hour. Tavin did not go to the recess room. He walked out of the civic building and stood on the plaza and looked at the memorial, which he had been looking at a great deal lately, and thought about what Suvek had done. She had asked the right question. It was, when you examine it, the only question. Who is harmed by the truth? The answer he had always given, the answer in the paper, the answer in 12 years of work, was, the social order is harmed. The coherence of the present is harmed. When a population becomes oriented toward historical grievance rather than current life, they become difficult to govern, which is to say difficult to serve, which is to say that the project of civilization is hampered. This was the argument. He still believed the logic of it, in the abstract. What he could not believe anymore, standing in front of the first administrator's raised hand on a clear morning in Caliph, was that it was sufficient. He was thinking about the construction worker who had put the documents in his truck. He was thinking about the dealer who had brought them to DAV Combe. He was thinking about the chain of custody, the word archivists used for the history of how a document passed from hand to hand, that had brought those 47 names from the cramped handwriting of a dead woman to the pages that Suvek had just read in silence. Each link in that chain was a person who had made a decision to preserve rather than discard, a decision to carry rather than leave behind, a decision to remember. He had spent 12 years trying to break those chains. He had done it in 17 cases. He had been efficient and thorough and had not, until now, thought very carefully about what exactly he was breaking when he broke them. What he was breaking, he understood now, was not the storage of information. You could always argue about storage, about what information was valuable, what was inflammatory, what served the public good, and what undermined it. Those were real arguments. The compendium made those arguments, and they were not entirely without merit. What he was breaking was a decision to remember. The human act of saying, this happened, this person was here, this name belongs to a real life that ended in a real way, and I will carry this forward so that the carrying itself means something. He was breaking the chain of custody between the dead and the living. He stood on the plaza for 40 minutes. Then he went back inside. When the proceedings resumed, Korath presented the Bureau's formal response, which was careful and procedurally sound, and did not answer the questions Suvek had asked. It explained the authorization framework at length. It cited precedents. It argued the importance of institutional coherence. It was, in its way, a very good legal document. Tavin watched Suvek read it. He watched her face, which told him nothing but which gave him the impression of a person deciding something. She set it down. She looked at the room. She looked at Marin, who was sitting with her hands folded on the table and her spine very straight, with the quality of a person who has been waiting for something for a long time and has learned to wait without urgency. I am going to make a preliminary determination, Suvek said, which will be subject to appeal and which I expect will be appealed. I want to be clear about that. This is not a final ruling. It is a step. Korath inclined his head. Marin did not move. The Bureau's legal authority to regulate historical materials is valid, and I am not overturning it. What I am ruling is that the materials submitted by the respondent party, the document of 47 names and supporting historical evidence, constitute, under the provisions of the Civil Record Preservation Act of 290 IE, a matter of public historical record. They document identifiable individuals and their treatment by agents of the state. Under the Act, such records are classified as civil testimony, not as historical commentary, and their suppression would require a higher evidentiary standard than the Bureau has met in this proceeding. She paused. The Rotterdam materials, she said, insofar as they document specific acts by identified state agents against identifiable members of the population, are civil testimony. They are accordingly admissible to the public record and are not subject to Bureau restriction under the current authorization framework. I am issuing a provisional order to this effect. I expect, she added, looking at Korath, that this will be appealed. I expect the appeal to be heard in the capital. I expect it to take some time. I am issuing the provisional order today regardless. Korath said, Magistrate, this ruling is provisional. Suvek said, as I stated, the Bureau has every right to appeal. I recommend it do so promptly. She gathered her papers. She did not look at Marin again. She did not need to. The order was already a document. The proceedings were already a record. The 47 names were already, as of this moment, part of the public record of the Veth Consolidated Empire. That was a step. The appeal would take 18 months. In those 18 months, several things happened. The lecture series in the Memory House bookshop expanded, then was replicated in 4 other cities, all of them in provinces that had once been part of the Selu lowlands. The recording spread further. Theo Wex publishes maps, not through a licensed publisher, but through the specific mechanism of printing and distributing them physically, which was regulated but not prohibited. And people began, in fact, to walk the old province, to stand in the transit hub that was built on the site of what the Rotterdam documents called the Selu Administrative Center. The appeal was heard in the capital. Korath argued it with precision. The capital court's legal apparatus was more sophisticated than Suvek's provincial bench, and the arguments were more nuanced, and Tavin Sorbadmal, who had been seconded to the Bureau's capital team to assist in preparing the appeal, spent those 18 months reading, among other things, every document in the Rotterdam cache. He read them all. It took him months, because the administrative hand of the early empire required patience, and Preetha's transcriptions were careful, but the originals were complex. He read them in sequence, which meant that the final orders came last. He had been reading for a long time by the time he reached them. He sat with them for a full day without writing anything in his notebook. Then he wrote, I cannot do this anymore. He thought about this for 3 more days. He thought about the paper he had written, and the prize it had won, and the 12 years of work and the 17 cases, and the specific irreversibility of what happened when a chain of custody was broken. He thought about the construction worker with the truck. He thought about Isel Korath writing 47 names in a slanting hand. He thought about the teacher named to not organizing children into groups and teaching them songs while they waited. He resigned from the Bureau of Cultural Coherence on the first day of the month of settling, which the old calendar would have called something else. The Capital Court issued its ruling 14 months after the appeal was filed. It upheld, with modifications, Suvek's provisional order. The modifications were significant. The Bureau retained authority over framing and contextualization of the Rotterdam materials, which meant that how the documents could be discussed publicly was still regulated, and this would generate its own set of subsequent proceedings and appeals and interpretations that would run for years. But the materials themselves, the documents, the 47 names, the administrative records, remain in the public record. They could not be made to disappear. Marin received the ruling at the Memory House bookshop because that was where she happened to be when Senna sent her the message. She was helping to organize the expanded lecture materials, which had grown from Senna's original curriculum into something that now involved 7 contributors in 4 cities, and a physical archive that had expanded to 3 locations with more careful security than anything they had managed in the early years. She sat down in one of the chairs among the licensed books and read the ruling twice. Then she set down the tablet and looked at the shelves. DAV was there, because DAV was usually where she was. He looked at her and did not ask. It's not over, she said. No, the framing restrictions will be contested for years. The Bureau will find other mechanisms. The appeal court wasn't being generous. They were being conservative. They found the narrowest possible ruling that didn't require them to adjudicate the larger question. Yes, DAV said, but the documents are in the record. Yes. She looked at the shelves. She thought about Aizel Karata's ledger, which was in the main archive, which was in a location she would not name here, held in acid-free boxes in controlled conditions. She thought about the 47 names and what it meant that they were in the public record now, not resolved, not answered, but present, undeniable, requiring the Empire to explain itself if it wanted to engage with them at all, requiring the Empire to acknowledge that they existed. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the whole of what she had spent 11 years working toward. And it was both more and less than she had imagined. Less because she had imagined, in her more hopeful moments, something like resolution, something like acknowledgement, something like the Empire saying, "This happened, we did this, we are sorry." She knew this was not realistic. She had always known it, but hope was not always realistic. More because the thing she had underestimated was the durability of simply being in the record, not argued, not resolved. Just there. The 47 names were there now. They were there in Suvek's provisional order and in the appeal proceedings and in the capital court's ruling and in the 47-page document that Marin had written and Senna had filed and the magistrate had read in silence. They were there in all those places, and they could not be made to not be there. She thought about what Lev had said months ago in the basement of the grain cooperative. The body knows. She thought about what it meant for a civilization to carry something in its body, not in its official memory, not in its approved record, but in the accumulated choices of individuals who had decided to carry something forward. The construction worker, the dealer, DAV finding the ledger in a box of cookbooks, Preetha spending months with it, Senna opening the door of the memory house every morning. The Empire had a mechanism for forgetting. Every empire did. It was efficient and it was effective and it worked most of the time on most populations because forgetting was easier than remembering and because the official story was the one that was everywhere, on the memorials and the compendium in the administrative present tense that organized daily life. Humans did not have a mechanism for forgetting. This was not a virtue. Exactly. It was a condition. They carried everything. The beautiful and the terrible, the names of the living and the names of the dead, the record of what had been done, and who had done it, and who had been present when it was done. They carried it in ledgers and in caches, and in lecture series, and in maps, and in the handwriting of dead women, and in the institutional memory of librarians who had been quietly dismissed for inconsistencies in cataloging philosophy. They could not stop carrying it. It was simply what they were. Tavin Sorvadmal did not appear at the Memory House bookshop after his resignation. He did not contact anyone from the Continuance Project. He moved back to the capital and took a position at a university, historiography, which he had studied before he had taken the other path, and he taught. And he was a good teacher because he had spent 12 years understanding what the management of history looked like from the inside, and he could explain it in a way that made students understand exactly what it was. He finished writing something in his small notebook on the day the Capitol Court issued its ruling. He had been working on it for 18 months. It was not a paper for publication. It was for himself, an accounting of the work he had done over 12 years, case by case, with an assessment of what had been accomplished and what had been lost. He was honest about both. He described the 17 cases with precision. He described the documents that had been recovered and classified, and the ones that had been destroyed, and the ones that had been successfully archived, and the ones whose chain of custody had been broken beyond repair. He did not know what to do with the accounting when he had finished writing it. He thought about putting it in a drawer. He thought about burning it. He put it in an envelope and sent it to the Memory House bookshop in Caliph, addressed to no one in particular. Senna opened it. She read it. She brought it to Preetha. Preetha read it carefully, with the particular care she applied to documents whose provenance required interpretation. Then she looked at Senna. "Archivist's testimony," she said. "Yes," Senna said. Preetha placed the pages in an acid-free folder and labeled it in her precise handwriting. She noted the date and the origin and the condition of the document. She noted that it had been received unsealed, in good condition, with no accompanying letter. She placed it in the archive where it would stay, where it would be found, where it would mean something to someone at some point in the future that neither of them could see but that they were in this moment and in all the moments that had led to this moment and in all the moments that would follow it, working to make possible. The archive breathed in the cool of the basement, old paper, something underneath it, the smell of time, which is also the smell of refusal, the refusal of the dead to stay entirely silent, the refusal of the living to pretend they couldn't hear. This story was brought to you by HSY Stories. Subscribe to our channel and be the first to experience every new story.